Hey everyone, Kate from the Narrate team here. In week 2 of Narrate series Gifting Wonder, Adam asked the question, what if questions make for great relationship with God? Adam shares examples from the Bible of individuals who were near God and felt free to ask questions towards God.
I'm going to do something that when's the last time you turned off your cell phone? I don't mean like silence, I mean turned off. I'm not asking you to do that, I'm just doing that because I'm going to do something today that I've never done before, which is watch the Bronco game recorded. Like, I don't have TiVo, but I shamelessly asked a friend if they would record it and we would watch it. So if you're my friend, you won't. Well, I'm not even going to turn my phone on until 6 o'clock. So if you have an emergency, there's lots of staff people that you can text, but not me. I'm not your guy. Hi, you guys. It is great to be with you. So if you weren't with us last week and you're wondering what is with that, we're in this conversation called Gifting Wonder, and as we talked about last week, really last week we just started by asking a whole bunch of questions, and really what we're trying to get at is this: what if, or what we got at last week was, what if among the best gifts you've ever received, what if among them was someone else's sincere, abiding interest in you? Like, what if one of the greatest things that we can receive, one of the best things that we can give is a sincere interest in another, where we lean forward, we listen more than we talk, we ask questions, we even follow up with questions, and we just simply care. In fact, one of the questions we asked last week was, who are they? Like, who are those people that as you look back over the course of your life, who are those people who leaned forward and they were sincerely interested in you, and it's maybe why you do what you do vocationally today. It's maybe why you follow Jesus. It's perhaps why you married who you did, because they were particularly interested in you, and hopefully that persists. But who are those people who leaned forward, who were sincerely intrigued, who asked questions? And we just use that to begin to kind of spark this conversation about questions. Really, this is a series about asking questions about asking questions. In fact, one of the questions we asked last week was just, what is the value of a question? And again, I don't think this is new information, and I don't mean to be patronizing, but just to kind of take a deep breath before we go sit at the family Thanksgiving, before we do the festivities and the office Christmas parties and all that, and just to remind ourselves, maybe some of the best things that we can do to serve people is to ask. In fact, we made a few observations that I just thought, as we kind of build on this, might be helpful to remind ourselves of last week. First, go ahead, next slide. We said that questions emphasize what we don't know, not what we do. That they create space, no matter what your level of expertise, to kind of step back and go, okay, what can I learn? Which means that questions also make the conversation, go to that next slide, questions make the conversation about the other, not ourselves. And I think sometimes inadvertently we become very self-centered conversationalists, not because that's our intent, but just in the excitement of seeing someone that we really like, we download all this information. And then I just this week hung out with a friend who had some big stuff going on, and realized in the enthusiasm of spending a couple hours with them, I walked away and went, dang, there was this really big event in their life, and they didn't ask. The other thing we observed to that next slide is that questions empower, right? Because especially when you're higher on the org chart, especially when you have more age, more wisdom, more experience, when socioeconomic status divides, and this is something I'm terrible at, but even when I started studying this stuff in a form that became a series, I was just reminded of when you ask a question, you empower the person you're asking. Like org charts and hierarchies and all that stuff go out the window, because in asking the question, you're handing the microphone over to another, maybe a child, maybe to someone much younger than you, maybe to somebody who's new in the organization, but you're handing it over. And then fourth, we said that questions force and hopefully I'm not the only one, force our otherwise lazy, quick to jump to conclusions brains. They invite us to ponder unconsidered possibilities. That even if we are going to get selfish, and turns out we all are, one of the things questions allow us to do is to just learn something new and explore new ideas. And so this morning, what I want to do, and it's really going to take us a couple weeks to do it, but this morning where I want to turn a corner in this conversation is, we called last week Small Me, Big You, and we're calling this week Small Me, Big God. Because what I would like to wonder and create conversation around is, what if everything that we know that a question does to a relationship with another person, and I'm guessing that none of us are really pushing back on that, but what if everything we know makes for great relationships with people also makes for great relationship with God? And what if being a faithful, even Christ-following person, what if it doesn't mean a longer and longer list of statements, but sometimes it means a longer and longer list of questions? In other words, maybe you're someone here who feels like your faith is slipping through your fingers. What if the questions don't communicate a lack of faith, but a depth of faith? And what if in the same way you feel so valued when your husband remembers to ask you when you get home from the day, like how that went? What if God feels the same way? What if he loves it when you lean forward and you don't plug in your old answers and you ask a question and you create space and even relationships for him to answer? And what if conversely he wants to take an interest in you? And what if you're wrong in thinking that going to church or reading the text is all about God preaching to you? What if God is such a brilliant conversationalist that he too knows the value of asking you questions? You know, I wonder, Christ followers, churches, Christians, we're so famous for our statements that end with an exclamation point. I wonder if we would serve people more effective if we were more famous for our questions. And what strikes me about that is when you open up the text, what you see is a long litany of people whose relationship with God was, I think, something most of us envy. And when we read about them, we think they're these other humanly kind of people. And yet at the center of their relationship so often is their ability to ask God questions. In fact, if you were a Jewish person, one of the people, if not the person at the very top of the faith journey chart, what would be a guy who is brilliant at asking questions. In fact, there is this guy, even for a Christ follower, who his interactions with God, I think this one interaction we're going to look at that happened between him and God might be the most famous interaction any person has ever had with God, to the extent that Hollywood has made movies about this interaction. And yet what stands out to me and what I want us to look at is at the center of his part of the interaction were questions. And I wonder, what if we related to God like that? See, Moses, when he was 80 years old, let's just start with his story there. He was in the desert. He had made a new life for himself. He was a shepherd. He found a new people group to be a part of. He had a wife and kids and an income. And it just seems that he reestablished himself in the desert, having failed miserably in the last season. And as he's wandering the desert, he happens upon a bush that is apparently on fire, but there's something unique about that fire. He walks up to it and finds himself having an interaction with the God of the universe. And we don't even necessarily know what his status was with God at this point in his journey, because we don't hear anything from the time he's 40 to about now. And this God, he says to Moses, hey, Moses, there's these people, the people of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, you know, the ones that you gave your life to and then they totally ratted you out and didn't do anything about it. Like those people, they're groaning, Moses. They want their freedom. They're begging me to come get them out of this mess in Egypt and lead them into their own place where they can have their own relationship with me and they're not brutalized by their slave masters. And I wonder, what was Moses' emotional response to that? Have you ever wanted something for someone more than they wanted it for themselves? Of course you have. Whether it was an addiction or a relationship that you wanted them to get into or out of, a job, a path, maybe you had a child and you could see they were particularly good at this, but they weren't interested in that. If you've ever wanted something for someone else and then realized you were wanting it more for them than they wanted it for themselves, that's Moses' story. He, at 40 years old, saw the situation that Israel were in. He decided he would spark a rebellion. He committed a murder. He tried to lead the people into this promising new future. And in the midst of his brave, heroic, sacrificial act, they said thanks but no thanks. He became a fugitive of the state. That's why he was in the desert. That's why he's not eating at the prince's table, which is where he was in Egypt. And now he's this nomadic shepherd Bedouin person. And God says to him, hey, Moses, they're crying out for a leader. They're crying out for me to rescue them. And I wonder, what was his emotional response? Was it good for them? It's about time. Was it heartbroken? Was he still with them or was he bitter towards them? I don't know that we get to know for sure. But in the midst of that interaction, then God has the audacity to say, so Moses, I'm sending you to go do that. Now again, just stop long enough to put yourself in his situation. He tried that. Like someone said, you should start your own one of these businesses. He did. It cost him everything. He had to file bankruptcy. He had to move to a new state. He has now decided, like, listen, I'm not owner material. I'm employee material. Not doing that again. Like he did it and it failed. And now God's asking him to believe all over again that he should lay it all aside, he should sacrifice it all, he should go and lead these people. I guess my point is this: if you're Moses, what's your response in that moment? And what stands out to me was what Moses' response was. Because I think he had all the same questions, probably all the same positive and negative emotion, and yet he took a deep breath. At least that's what I think, because I don't know that you can ask questions if you don't take a deep breath. And listen to what Moses said. Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? So you just notice, Moses could have either like plugged in everything he was thinking and thought he knew, or he could get vulnerable and ask a question. And God, this is one of my favorite verses in all of the Bible. God said, I will be with you. And there's a whole conversation about what's happened in this interaction, because God's going, it's not about you, it's about me, but I'm going to use you. And Moses goes, okay, that was good, but suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask, what is his name? Then what shall I tell them? In other words, okay, thank you, that's very kind of you to say you're with me, but remember, I'm going to show up and they're going to go, huh? Then what do I do? And God, and this is part of where this observation of what questions do, God gives him this incredible revelation, and we can't even begin to do justice with it, because God says, go tell them I am who I am, which is a terrible English translation of a word that an honest scholar doesn't even really know what it means, but we do know that in this paragraph, the I am God that Jesus self-identifies with in his own life, he gives whole new revelation of his character to Moses. And I think it's important just to stop and go, notice, it was Moses' ability to ask God a question, not plug in his preconceived understandings, that invited him to learn new things about who this God was. And yet Moses isn't done. God gives him this long, profound self-revelation, and Moses says, okay, but you're kind of missing my point. What if they don't believe me or listen to me? And what if they say the Lord didn't appear to you? Like, hello, 40 years ago, like, come on, are you working with me here? And God says, hey, what's that in your hand? And he says, it's a staff, and there's this whole interaction, and God says, take the staff with him, and does this kind of miraculous things with all the staff is going to do. It's kind of this incredibly powerful thing. And I love the humanness of Moses' response, picking up in verse 13. He says, pardon your servant, Lord, please send someone else. Like, that was a fantastic sales pitch, but I don't want to buy the knives, right? Like, that's really what's going on. And yet God persists, and Moses agrees. He walks into Egypt. He raises his fist. He walks into the Pharaoh's palace, says, hey, I got bad news. God's on these people's side. He's going to lead them into freedom. He goes and tells the people, hey, good news. I'm God's guy again. I know, but I'm 40 years smarter. Like, let's go. Pharaoh, in his, I don't know, was he threatened or was he just aware that he had more power? All he did in response was turned up the heat. He gave them more responsibility, and you may have noticed the busier you are, the less time you have to think about life and relationships and God, and that's exactly what he did. He increased the vocational burden on these slaves, the result of which was their lives were even more miserable, and they came to Moses and they said, hey, thanks a lot for your help, but you can go now. Now put yourself there. You sold everything and started a business once. Like, you sacrificed it all once. God told you to do this thing one time. You did it. You looked like a fool. You had to completely start over. He showed up a second time, and you were dumb enough to believe him. And here he is. What's your response? In fact, I wonder for how many of you, you're living the response. Like, you've not talked to God since that moment, that second divorce, that second failed business, that additional miscarriage. Like, you've not talked to God since. And nobody could blame you. And Moses does something that I think is profoundly courageous. He goes to God, and rather than lambast him with statements, rather than walk away and not talk to him, in the vulnerability of his moment, he says, why Lord, why have you brought this trouble on this people? Which says a lot about Moses right there, because he's not after success, he's after significance. It's not even about him. Like, really, Lord? You're going to put them through this again? Is this why you sent me? See, I think in your understanding of God, I guess the question that I'm trying to ask is do you leave room for questions? In religion, I don't like to self-identify as religious, but for the sake of conversation, in religion, what is the place of questions? Are they allowable? Should you ask them? Must you ask them? Ray Vanderland is one of my favorite scholars of first century Jewish life. I've actually had the privilege of studying with him a couple different times, and he tells a story in Israel. There was this time where he took this group of people. He would like to take people to this famous rabbi's art studio, and this rabbi was famous for his art because they were paintings, but he would use like microscopic lettering to paint the paintings, and so they were actually verses, but when you stood back, they just looked like paintings. There's actually a word for that kind of style. I don't remember what it is. But he tells the story of a time that he took this group there, and there was this woman that happened to be particularly captured by the art. And she caught the rabbi who was in the studio that day, and she walked up to him and said, "Hey, I really love your art. I'd really like to buy a piece of your art. I just don't know which one to buy." And then she said, "I know. Which one's your favorite?" And he said to her, remember, he's a rabbi. He's a master of questions. He said to her, "Are you married?" She wasn't sure what to do with that. And she said, "Well, yes, I am married." And he said, "Do you have any children?" And she said, "Yes." And he said, "How many?" And she said, 3. And he said, "What are their names?" And she said, "Peter, Paul, and Mary." I don't know their names. And he said, "What are their ages?" And she said, 15, 13, and 6. And he said, "Ooh, one slipped through the cracks, eh?" He didn't actually say that. And he said, what are they like?" And she started, as any of you would your kids, started to describe the remarkable things despite their imperfections about their kids. And finally she took a deep breath, and he looked at her and he said, "Which is your favorite?" See, there is a way of asking a question, and I think this is what makes us skeptical. There is a way of asking a question that creates distance, isn't there? There is a way to use a question as a device to avoid relationship. There is a way to use a question to just dig your heels in and stick with there's gotcha questions, and they're gross. But isn't there also a way to ask a question that actually makes relationship more profound? Isn't there a way to ask a question that doesn't demonstrate a lack of knowledge, but a depth of knowledge? Listen, I get it. We are so focused on what to believe, and we should. Sin and the cross and the resurrection, it's a big deal. This isn't just like how to live your life better. This is how to know God. But in the midst of our pursuit of what hills must we die on, might it be that sometimes God welcomes a question, and sometimes our place is to ask it. You know, the name Israel, there's several podcasts and a book that you can reference on your mind map. Rob Bell points out in a podcast recently, the name Israel, it doesn't mean love. It doesn't mean victorious. It doesn't mean triumphant. It doesn't mean everything turns out in the end. The word Israel, so central to our faith. You know what the word Israel means? It means to struggle. It means to wrestle. In fact, that whole meaning is taken from this place in Jacob's story when Jacob, and you find this in Genesis 32, Jacob was sleeping by himself alongside a stream when in the middle of the night, this man happens upon him and they start to wrestle. It's weird. Like, it's not totally surprising if you have boys because, like they could just wrestle anytime, anywhere. Like they just wrestle. That's what they do. But nonetheless, they just start wrestling. But then we learn that this man who started wrestling Jacob he's a God man. And so as they're wrestling, we're told in the story that as Jacob and this God-man wrestle, Jacob wasn't able to prevail upon him. And likewise, this God-man couldn't defeat him, which is kind of strange. And in the midst of their wrestling, this God-man, knowing that he can't defeat Jacob, he touches Jacob's hip and destroys his hip. It's like he's been playing in the NFL for 15 years, instantly, which raises all kinds of questions because he can't beat Jacob in a wrestling match, but he can just touch his hip and suddenly his game is over. And as they're wrestling, some would say that part of what we have to understand here, by the way, is that the story is told from Jacob's perspective. And then in fact, what's going on is this is like a grandpa wrestling with his 3-year-old granddaughter or grandson. This is like a father and a daughter, a father and a son, a mother and a daughter, or whatever. Lots of people can, this is like the 3-year-old and the 30-year-old. And that the point here is, yes, the God-man could have won, and he could have won triumphantly and instantly, but that's kind of not the point. The point, some would say, is the relationship that happens because of the engagement. And as the sun is beginning to rise, this God-man says to Jacob, I got to go because the sun is rising, which is weird. Like, okay, so are you a werewolf? Like, what? I don't quite understand. What is this? And in the midst of the wrestling, this Jacob says to the God-man, like, I'm not going to let you go until you give me a blessing. And the God-man says to Jacob in Genesis 32, what is your name? And Jacob says, my name is Jacob. And the man said, your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome. What if it's a willingness to struggle with God and with people, to wrestle, to lean in, to ask questions? What if that is central to what it means to be a part of Jacob's heritage of faith? A willingness to ask, a willingness to go there, what some would say, a willingness to go to the mat with God. Because see, there is a way of relating to God where when God does something that you don't like, you just walk away and never talk again, or even talk about it. I guess I would submit to you that's not what we see from Moses. It's not what we see from Jacob. And it's not what we see from a guy named Job, who in some ways embodies the worst of the worst. Job, of course, his story was that he was this powerful, wealthy, healthy guy. He also loved God, and Satan shows up in God's heavenly court, whatever that looks like, and says he wouldn't love you so much if you would just not give him so many blessings. And so they strike this deal, and Satan is allowed to crush Job's house, killing all of his kids, as far as we can tell, save his wife. And Job's response in chapter 1, you've heard it at many funerals, the Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Very pious, very flowery in the midst of all this suffering, very formulaic, very like, I get God, and here's how I explain this situation. Satan turns up the dial again. This time, it's this horrendously painful skin condition, and his wife is now kind of goading him into doing something, and Job says, shall we accept good from God and not trouble? Notice it's not as flowery, it's not as pious, but it's still formulaic, and it's still very black and white, and it's still very like, I've got the corner on God, and I understand what's happening here. And as time persists, he continues to cling to his formula. God did this, and there's nothing I can do about it. But his emotional response becomes more and more negative. In Job 16, listen to his response here. He says, all was well with me, but he shattered me. He's God, by the way. He seized me by the neck and crushed me. He made me his target. His archers surround me. Without pity, he pierces my kidneys and spills my gall on the ground. Don't even know what that is, but it doesn't sound good, does it? He continues in chapter 30. I cry out to you, God, but you do not answer. I stand up, but you merely look at me. You turn on me ruthlessly. With the might of your hand, you attack me. You snatch me up and drive me before the wind. You toss me about in the storm. Notice that the pious, flowery language is gone, but the formula is still there. The black and white, God did this, and I don't like it, it's still there. Now, the other part of the story is Job's 3 friends, who they also have a formula. And their formula is God is just, and the reason you're suffering the only possible reason that could be is because there's something unrighteous in your life, and so deal with it. And Job is like, no, there's nothing unrighteous. This is happening because God did it, not because he's trying to punish me or kind of do anything against me because I sinned against him. And they go like, no, he's doing it because you sinned against him. They, you see, can't handle a world where random things happen to good people. They can't conceive of a world where there's this ill-advised suffering. Job can, but he places the reason for the suffering on God. And then God shows up, and you should read this again in your chair time or for the first time. God shows up, and it's this thunderous, like, how dare you claim to have such simple formulas for how creation works? Who made, and remember he kind of starts going off, who made this and who made that? How dare you think you get this? See, what he's saying to them is it's not that cut and dry. It's not that black and white. Your little simple formulas, they don't work for you. And in the end, God, he commends Job. And Job says to him, surely I spoke of things I did not understand, things too wonderful for me to know. Job gets to this place where he recognizes the cause of evil and suffering and darkness and all that way more complex than his pious, flowery formulas can ever explain. He kind of steps into the tension and goes, okay, Lord, I get it. I'm not going to try to offer some long dissertation on why that happened. Sometimes the world that I don't see is just too big and too complicated for me to write a formula on. But what's fascinating is what God says to Job's friends. He says, I'm angry with you and your two friends. He's talking to the first person to one of the friends, because you have not spoken the truth about me as my servant Job has. See, that's why many of us, the reason why we think that the purpose of the book is the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away, the reason why that's read at many of funerals is because he says the truth. But some would say that the truth there, we're misunderstanding it. See, that word truth, the Hebrew word there, it can be translated accurate, it can be translated right. It can also be translated honest. Some would say the entire purpose of the book of Job is to help people see how God led Job out of his simplistic, formulaic understandings of God and into an embracing of a God who is both good and mysterious. Some would say that the Job story is ultimately about God praising Job because Job had Israel-like faith and he went to the mat with God and he talked to God about his struggles. And his friends talked only about God. His friends were never willing to acknowledge the simplicity and even duplicity of their formulas. Some would say that Job steps in a long line of God followers who understood that sometimes truth is best expressed in the form of a question. Abraham Joshua Heschel was a 20th century rabbi, and I've referenced this before, but it's very formative to my thinking. He's a 20th century rabbi who very famously years ago said that the Western education system is backwards because he said, you think that to measure the level of interest or the level of understanding a person has, that you ought to give them the questions and in turn have them give you the answers. But he said a real depth of understanding is demonstrated by the ability to give them the answers and have them give you the questions. What if what you see Moses and Job and Israel and lots of other people doing in the text, what if you see them demonstrating the depth of their understanding by their questions? Listen, what if your questions, what if they don't indicate that your faith is slipping through your fingers? What if they actually indicate that your faith is far more expansive than it used to be? And yeah, there's this kind of hippie, like, yeah, whatever, I don't know anything. And I don't mean to disrespect that. I guess I just did, so I shouldn't say both things. There's a form of agnosticism that's not really looking for an answer. Like that's the identity, is the lack of an answer. And there is a form of agnosticism, just like there is a form of Christianity that is leaning forward and absolutely in pursuit of an answer, doing the work, asking the questions, consulting the scriptures, and really listening. What if God invites you into that kind of relationship with him? You know, John Ortberg, and there's another podcast I reference on that notebook, or on that mind map, he, I believe it was in October, did this long study on the difference in the Bible between the words groaning and the words grumbling. And what's interesting is the word groaning is always welcomed in the text. You see David doing lots of groaning in the text. The word grumbling is always called out and condemned. Even Paul says you should do everything without grumbling and complaining. And you know what the difference between the two is? Here, I'm going to save you 30 minutes of your life, though it's really worth listening to the podcast. You know what the difference between groaning and grumbling is in the text? Groaning is directed to God. Grumbling is about God. Groaning is something you say to God's face. Grumbling is something you say behind his back. You know the pain, don't you? Of having someone call into question everything about your motives, everything about your vision, everything about your desires, everything about your thinking. You know the pain of finding out from the second or third person that behind your back that's getting called out, don't you? Like, is there anything more painful than finding out that somebody who had every opportunity to come to you hasn't come to you, they've just went to others? Listen, whether you're a boss or a parent or a spouse, is there anything more gross than that group of wives or that group of husbands who get together and just, I can't even use the word from the stage, but they just gripe about, is there anything more gross than that? And not taking it to him, not taking it to her? And at the same time, is there anything that bonds more than when someone comes to you and you do the work and you even agree to disagree, but they brought it to you? What if he works kind of like that? What if God goes, your questions, your frustrations, you're like wailing, you're like, why? Like, it's all fair game. But trust me enough to have the conversation with me, not behind my back. What if he welcomes our questions? And what if great ones, they don't demonstrate a lack of faith, but a depth of faith? Can you imagine what would happen if suddenly your thinking shifted from a God who has all these points that he needs you to know about him to a God who has all these, like this relationship he wants you to have with him? Can you imagine what would happen if chair time and prayer and all the things that we do in life to connect with God, if they were less about memorizing bullet points and more about engaging in the relationship? Can you imagine what would happen if you sat in the chair and just for 15 minutes surrendered your perfectly conceived structure of God and his character? Can you imagine what would happen? And I don't say this patronizing. I do this every day too. But can you imagine what would happen in your interactions with God if you were just willing to open yourselves up to the fact that you don't know him perfectly? That there's things about him and his character that he would love for you to know. Can you imagine what would happen if the off limits, out of bounds, I'm frustrated with this, if it was actually a conversation you had with him, not about him? Listen, maybe you're someone here and you had your Moses at 80 moment and it happened a second time and you and God haven't talked since. We would love to be an influence in your life of re-engaging in that conversation. And if following Jesus is something you're interested in, to be perfectly honest with you, we still haven't found a device that allows you to kind of identify that that's what you're doing. The only device we have is relationship. And we would just say, seek out the person you came with, seek out someone from the staff, shoot us a voicemail, shoot us a text, whatever. But can you imagine what would happen for all of us if we engage in our relationship with Christ, with God, the way Moses did, the way Jacob did, that he went to the mat with God to such an extent that that became his name? And what if that really is the faith legacy of God's people? I'd like to pray, and we're going to sing one more song. God, we are grateful for who you are, and God, we just recognize that our questions and the mystery are not in tension with the finality of who you are. That you are good, that you are trustworthy, that you are the self-existent one, Lord. That the struggle is ours in knowing you and knowing you accurately. Jesus, we cling to the cross. We cling to the resurrection. Jesus, we cling to those things we know we have to cling to. And yet we're not here because we want some kind of religious out. We're here, Lord, because we want personal relationship with you. Would you more and more empower us to be the kinds of people who are talking with you about the things going on in our lives, trusting you with them. We love you, Jesus. Amen.
If you would like to engage further with Narrate Church, you can find contact information online, www.narratechurch.org. We would love to hear from you.